So hello everyone and welcome to the New Book Forum. My name is Nils Güttler and I'm a postdoc at the Chair for Science Studies at ETH Zurich, and together with Niki Rhyner, who's a doctoral student in our group. Hi Niki. We are hosting the second session of the New Book Forum, and we are very glad that you're all here. So the New Book Forum, just a few words about it. It's a collaborative initiative by scholars from Zurich, namely Lisa Haushofer and Monika Wulz. Hi Lisa and hi Monika. And we are combining three institutions, the Center for History of Knowledge, the Chair of History of Medicine at University of Zurich, and our science study group at ETH. And the book forum aims to showcase and discuss new books in the histories of science, medicine, and environment with their authors. And we imagine it to be a platform for also to present their books, to talk about their motivations, their hidden agendas, stuff that didn't make it into the book, the whole process of writing, whatever. So we'll see, and today our guest is Professor Erika Milam, who joins us from our office at Princeton University in New Jersey. So hi, Erika, we're really glad that you're here. Hi. And we will talk about this book today, Creatures of Cain, The Hunt for Human Nature in Cold War America. And before we start, some technical details. We have 1 hour. And in the next couple of minutes, Niki will introduce Erika, and then the three of us are going to talk about the book for roughly 30 minutes. And after that, we open the floor, and everyone is very warmly invited to ask questions and participate in the discussion. And the official part will last until 7 p.m. sharp, and whoever wants to join us for more informal exchange is invited to stay for another 20 minutes or so.
Yeah, so before we start to discuss the discussion about the book, it's really my pleasure to introduce our guest. Hello, Erika. Erika Milam is professor of history and the program in the history of science at Princeton University. Her research is focused on the history of the modern life sciences, especially evolutionary theory and ecology. Creatures of Cain, the book we are discussing today, is her most recent monograph and was published by Princeton University Press in 2019. Erika has published widely on gender relations in science, on Darwinism and evolutionary theory, on animals as models for human behavior. Her first book was called Looking for a Few Good Males, Female Choice in Evolutionary Biology, which was published in 2010 by Johns Hopkins University Press. Her current project is called Timescapes of Behavior and aims at a history of behavioral ecology. And last but not least, I think she has developed an interest in the history of science fiction, and with some colleagues, she has put up a website called histsci-fi.com, and I can really recommend looking it up. So why did Nils and I choose this book? Well, one reason is quite simply that Creatures of Cain combines our research interests. While I'm working on the history of anthropology, Nils has researched the history of popular sciences. But more importantly, we think that it is actually a really novel way to tell the history of science in the second half of the 20th century. By writing the history of a specific theory, in this case, the killer ape theory, as a phenomenon that is constituted by both scientific disciplines such as anthropology, zoology, primatology, but also the public that itself changes after World War II. There's popular media, cinema, especially Hollywood, bestsellers, paperback culture, and so on. So Erika, my very first question to you would be, for those who haven't read the book, could you say a few words about the killer ape theory, how it emerged, and why you decided to write a book about its history?
Absolutely. And let me just begin by saying how delighted I am to be here today. Thank you so much for the invitation. And as we were saying earlier, there have to be some advantages to this Zoomiverse that we live in. And I'm delighted to be able to join from afar and to participate in this conversation. So thank you, Niki. Thank you, Nils, for the opportunity. I'm really delighted. In terms of the killer ape theory, I actually never intended to write a book about it. It was, I became interested in this project through the Mana Course of Study educational program And that was really my starting point. And what I found was that it was a program designed by very well-intentioned, sincere faculty members, scientists who were interested in contributing to a public conversation about science and improving the scientific literacy of children from when they were young, so that by the time that they were adults, they could be scientifically literate, engaged citizens. And the program that they created, Mana Course of Study, was the first of these educational programs to really deal with the social sciences. And it was based in evolutionary theory and embraced the idea that we can understand a lot about human nature by studying animal behavior. And I read the materials, found it totally fascinating, and then realized that there was a huge cultural backlash against it in Congress and in the American Congress, where it was held up as a brilliant example of money poorly spent by the National Science Foundation, and as really advancing the idea that humans are by nature violent and the worst kind of childhood education that could possibly have ever been supported by the federal government. And I thought, okay, well, that's super interesting. How do you end up with this real split in what happened, what the designers of this program intended, and the way that it was read culturally? And so I started going into the more popular scientific literature in order to understand how congressmen could have been so angered by this program. And that's when I realized how much of an influence these popular ideas about the violence of humanity were at the moment, and that the people who were reacting to Mana Course of Study were actually reacting to this other conversation. So that was my way in. And what I found was a story that I have described as the rise and the fall of the killer ape theory, which is a vision of that humans are both violent and cooperative is, of course, very long-standing. What happens with the killer ape theory is, especially in the hands of Robert Ardrey, violence gets used as the explanatory motivation, not explanatory motivation, the crucial piece of human evolution. And that when humans became capable, when human ancestors became capable of picking up a bone or a rock, a found weapon, and realizing that it could be used, in fact, as a weapon, that represented a particular kind of cognitive shift that enabled the rest of human evolution. So that all of the wonderful things that we think about human culture, about technology, about our ability to learn from one another came from this moment of the capacity for murder. And that vision has largely gone away, and had largely gone away by the mid-1970s. What has never left is the idea that there are potentially, that violence is a part of what it means to be human. And so those threads have continued, but the rise and the fall of the killer ape is really about this very specific theory about the capacity for human violence as at the center of human evolution.
Yeah, thanks, Erika. So the rise and the fall of the theory, right? Maybe you can stay there for a moment and talk a bit about the approach of your book, right? Because like at a first glance, really, like, your book looks like a history of ideas in a way, right? I mean, there's this idea, there's a theory, and you follow it through the decades after World War II. But like, after reading a couple of pages of your book, it's very clear that there's much more in it than like a traditional history of ideas, right? So you just mentioned Mana Course of Study, so this educational program, so there's educational history, like Bildungsgeschichte, as we would say in Germany. And but there's also, yeah, of course, political history of social movement. There's the whole popular science movement in the 1950s, 1960s. So I wondered if you could say a few words about your approach, so how you wrote this book, and also did you have a book in mind when you start writing it, like a kind of role model book for your book as well?
Yeah, absolutely. These on the one hand, you're right. It is a very straightforward history of ideas in the sense that what I am trying to answer is how and why ideas and understandings of human nature change in the United States from the mid-20th century to the 1980s. And what I think is different about the book are the variety of sources that I use to answer that question. And in addition to everything else that you mentioned, there's also ladies' magazines and popular Hollywood films and all sorts of things. And one of the real arguments that I would like to be able to make with the kind of work that I do is that in order to understand why scientific ideas change, we actually have to take into account all of this material. And that intellectual history that relies solely on publications that scientists write for other scientists misses so much of the rich cultural conversations and connotations of the work at that moment. And it was really surprising to me how far ideas about the killer ape traveled. I knew that Robert Ardrey, before he was publishing popular scientific books, had worked in Hollywood, but I actually had no idea that his connections to Hollywood led other Hollywood directors to cite his book as evidence for, or not as evidence, but maybe as an excuse for producing hyper-violent films in the second half of the 1970s as a way of saying, well, I'm just depicting human nature. Read those books by Robert Ardrey. And so it really felt like there were so many people who were wrestling with these questions. And when scientists worked on what they were doing, when they tried to answer these questions for themselves, the broader cultural context was always close at hand.
And the broader social cultural context also very present in the book. For instance, I mean, there's just one like out of dozens of images. And so I just wonder if you could say a few words also about the role of images in your book, because it's very, I mean, it's very obvious if you just skim through it that it plays an important role for your story, right?
Mm-hmm. I love the images in the book. There were so many more that I wish I could have put in. And one of the things that I did very deliberately when I chose the images is, so first of all, why so many images? And that's in part because evolutionary theories of human nature in this moment are highly visual. So I really felt like they were a part of the conversation, and that the images themselves were ways of communicating all of these ideas about human nature to the public, even if people weren't necessarily reading the article that they accompanied, then they would at least see the images. And that is certainly true for magazines like National Geographic, where I think a lot of people looked at the photographs and the images that were included, but maybe didn't even read the articles because it was so visually oriented. But all of the articles that I chose are drawings, that they are images that show the creation of the image as part of it. I deliberately chose not to use many photographs. I think there might be one photograph in the book. And that was because photographs are so easily seen as indexical that I really wanted to have line drawings, to have representations of human nature that showed the process of creation in them, rather than allowing readers of the book or readers of the images at the time they would have been produced as seen as simply reflecting a piece of evidence. So all of the images are very carefully chosen for exactly that reason. It also means that most of them are, even in their originals, black and white. There are a few images that were originally in color that I wish could have been reproduced in color, but that was not, yeah. But for the most part, they were as they were reproduced originally. I think so. The image question is totally fascinating, and it also brings me back to your previous question, which I realized I forgot to answer, which was about models for the book. And I read voraciously in the history of science. I love so much work that I find it difficult to identify sort of a particular model that I had in mind. The most obvious inspiration is Donna Haraway's Primate Visions, where she also uses visual material. She's also interested in questions of how does animal behavior and anthropology come together in order to answer these questions about human nature. I think that her work, I have always thought of her work as being, it's going to sound terrible, I've always thought of her work as being like a puppet show, that you see everything that's happening, but it's very difficult to see the strings. And what I wanted this book to be about are the strings. And how is it that all of these connections are made behind the scenes in ways that are not visible to a general reader, but are still profoundly influential in the way that we think about what it meant to be human. Other books I would mention are Jim Secord's Victorian Sensation, because of the investment in popular science and what does it mean, practices of reading, hugely inspirational. Rebecca Lemoff's World as Laboratory also, and Nicholas Rasmussen's On Speed, in part because it's such a gripping story and it does a really nice job of matching stories with technical detail. So those are just a few of the books that I read that I have enjoyed and helped provide me with a model. One of the things I find very difficult, actually, I found very difficult about writing the book was tone, because I found that this is, I think, true for all of us. If you read a lot of a particular kind of source, your writing style begins to reflect that source. And so I found that as I was reading Robert Ardrey, Elaine Morgan, that my prose would get more and more purple. It would just sort of really, yeah, my prose really changed, as opposed to reading Theodosius Dobzhansky or much more technically oriented writers. And so, yeah, I just had to be really careful. And it required, in the end, a thorough rewriting to make sure that the tone actually matched all of the pieces.
Yeah, I wanted to say it doesn't really show, or I didn't have the impression that that was really a problem, because the book really shows, or it's really like you handle all that different kinds of materials so well that it's really like one narrative going through those elements consisting of those popular science books, those media coverage, those movies, and so one really has it's really a distinct tone, and it also really makes sense about what you say about Donna Haraway's Primate Visions and the strings behind. That's really illuminating as well. Maybe to go back to a previous question about like that you really highlight the kind of public discourse and also the debates about violence in society, but you also like highlight that that it's really important to see that also the scholars themselves, they addressed other scholars and other intellectuals via those colloquial science books. So I wanted to talk about one specific case, also to show that some of your material in the book as well. So you discussed the case of Elaine Morgan. And maybe you can just like tell us about her and about her aquatic ape theory and how the debate about human nature was linked to the emergence of feminist approaches in science, but also how maybe this case shows how difficult the processes of how authority, scientific authority was granted or not in these debates about human nature.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. And also thank you for your comment earlier about the even tone of the book. It means so much to me because it took so much work to make that happen. And there was this moment of huge relief when you said that, because I was like, okay, so in terms of Elaine Morgan publishes a book called Descent of Woman in 1972, and it was supposed to come out in 1971 as a direct commentary on Charles Darwin's Descent of Man. That was where she was drawing the title from. And in the book, she does two things. The first thing that she does is that all of these stories about human evolution taking place because of coordinated male hunting on the savannah were male-centered. And she says, we scientists, general public in the early 1970s, used the word man to stand in for all of humanity. And that ends up with verbal slippage in meaning, whereby all of a sudden it becomes easy to talk about men's contribution to evolutionary theory as the only contribution that matters. But all of this, she says, is born out of particular interpretations of data. And she doesn't want to question the data itself. She just wants to say, actually, there's other ways of interpreting data. So if we find a cutting blade, was that used to strike down a foe? Was it used to bring down an antelope? Or was it used for chopping parsley? We actually have no idea how it was used. So the interpretation of what a tool is for carried particular kinds of gendered assumptions and social assumptions that went into it. So she said, okay, so I have another potential explanation for how this worked. And it doesn't involve coordinated hunting of men. It involves the gathering of women at the seashore. And part of the reason that there are no fossils associated with my story is, of course, because all of them have been lost, because that's not a very good environment for preserving fossils anyway. So there is no evidence against my theory that humans went through an aquatic phase that was more cooperative, that included women, females, as part of the story. So disprove me. And the book was picked up by, well, the book was extremely controversial when it came out. And she has no scientific training. She was employed by BBC Radio in Wales to write screenplays, and became so frustrated with all of the Tarzanist theories of human evolution, as she put them, that she decided she really wanted to write this book. And she provides an interesting counterexample to that of Ardrey, because Ardrey is also someone who doesn't have scientific training, who was a Hollywood screenwriter, whose undergraduate training was very much in the arts, and that was how he had crafted a career for himself. But their work is received very differently. And so whereas Ardrey was eventually invited to the Animal Behavior Society to give a keynote one year, and was embraced as a controversial but still relevant member of the extended animal behavior community, Elaine Morgan was always on the outside. And she was on the outside for interesting reasons. One, of course, not everyone wanted to take her theory seriously. And feminist anthropologists were worried that this would be interpreted as the best version of that feminist anthropology had to offer. And so there's a lot of pushback within the anthropological community from women who are very convinced by her arguments against the killer ape theory, against the Tarzanists, and they cite her work for that reason. But the aquatic ape theory is so foreign to the way that the scientists are thinking that, that she really ends up being framed as having perpetuated pseudoscience. And her work is compared to that of Erich von Däniken and other popular but outrageous scientific theories of the counterculture.
Yeah, I think the distinction between science and pseudoscience, right, is also interesting, like from a broader point of view, because you mentioned Clem Seacord's Victorian sensations, yeah? And so I think my question is, could you say a few words about how you would place your book into the historiography on popular science? And I'm asking this question because, at least from my reading, I mean, much that has been written on the history of popular science has a kind of Victorian science as a role model, right? And very much what the distinction between amateurs and scientists, and the role, for instance, of printing and journals and so on. So I wondered if you could say a bit more about it. Yeah, so how does that change in the 20th century, and especially after World War II? But also, when I read your book, it felt for me like there's really like a tradition ending in the 1970s, and that is scientists writing books. Right? And so there's this whole like new market for popular science writing, and there are now professional popular science writers who are not actually scientists anymore. And there are a lot of new people coming in, like Elaine Morgan, for instance, who really have an influence on the public image of science, right? So I wondered, yeah, if you could say a bit how you see your book in this kind of broader history of popular science. Yeah.
Absolutely, thank you. I think that there are, in the late 20th century, a lot of scholars of popular science at that moment look back to the late 19th century as a moment that feels very familiar to them in terms of the dynamics about how the relationship, as you say, between popular and professional science works, about the role of scientific journals and popular publications. And so in conversations about popular science in the 20th century, the most cited books are those that talk about Victorian scientific literature and the conversations at that moment. And I think that for me, this genre of colloquial science that I try to identify in the book is a bit of an aberration in the middle of the 20th century. And it's enabled by a couple of things. One is that after World War II, we have a similar change in technology in the way that the steam press is talked about as changing printing technology in the 19th century, where it becomes possible to produce really cheap paperbacks that are called at the moment intellectual paperbacks. And they are those little 50-cent Penguin volumes, and you can find them ubiquitously in used bookstores. And they published at that moment not only a lot of classics, they republished a lot of classic scientific literature, but they also were publishing new books by Margaret Mead, by Ruth Benedict, by Lauren Isley, Theodosius Dobzhansky. And these books, these intellectual paperbacks, were geared often towards both their scientific colleagues and also a more general audience. So that there's there's an assumption that you can write a single book that encompasses a book-length argument for your peers that is more complicated than can be articulated in a series of independent journal articles. And at the same time, that a member of the general audience might also be interested in reading this book. And so you have this real synergy in the market. And by the end of the story, I think what happens, as you said, is that there's the rise of scientific journalism. The rise of scientific journalism also occurs with the rise of the history of science, science technology studies more generally, so that there is a greater both professional and popular set of scholars and journalists who are interested in writing about science, so that the scientists themselves are not solely responsible for reaching out with their ideas to a general public. And you have a real bifurcation in the United States in publications that are intended either for a more general audience or for a professional audience. And as you said, there are very few science books now that are monographs that are intended for other scientific peers. Mm-hmm. They exist. I don't want to say they don't exist, but it's a much smaller genre than it used to be. And even those books are generally just for professional audiences and not also for general audiences.
My sense was when I read the book that you have a sympathy for the old model. So for scientists really writing book-length arguments, or was that a wrong impression?
No, I think you're right. I mean, so of course I'm a historian, right? So I love books. I actually wish that more people would write books. So it's perhaps predetermined. I think also though, so this book is an example for me. My book is an example for me of a kind of argument where I had to create a series of parallel stories that in total provide, I hope, a convincing picture of the narrative that I was telling and of the argument that I want to make. But any individual piece of it, if I were to write about just Man, A Course of Study, or just Hollywood movies, or just the publication of the 3 books by Robert Ardrey, Desmond Morris, and Konrad Lorenz, that each of those slices would not be convincing in and of itself, that actually it requires the larger argument, in essence, that scientific conversations and understandings of what it means to be human were deeply invested in these public conversations about science, that requires the layering of lots and lots of evidence. So this is, for me, the kind of argument I can only make with the length of a book, in the form of a book. And yeah, I think that these larger questions that have that kind of scope in the sciences are the reason that so many people became scientists in the first place. And I think that they are often inspirational for young people who read them and who decide as a result of that book that then they want to answer these kinds of questions too. And they want to go into scientific research because it will allow them to see this bigger picture. And that's what I would love to see more of. It was, the book opens with, the first chapter opens with Loren Eiseley and his beautiful writings about human evolution. And so many of the scientists that I interviewed who were publishing in the 1970s had read him when they were young. And so there's this looping effect. And I think there could be more of that into the future. Although now, of course, books are outdated. The way we do this is through documentaries, television shows, TikTok.
Yeah, I mean, we could take this discussion into the present moment, right? Like that kind of debate is still going on, also for the humanities. What role does the book length argument play, and so on? Mm-hmm. But I think at this point we could like ask the audience as well if they have questions, and if you do, please just put your name or something, some words into the chat, and we will give you the floor. And while people that's perfect already coming in, so we will go to Christian Reis.
Oh. Hey, thank you. Yeah, thank you for the nice first part, which was already a lot of fun, and I'm already a bit sad that it's over. But I'm also excited to be able to ask a question. And this, so I'm really excited how about the many points your book and my current research are touching, and in a way your book has already been some kind also an inspiration of how to find interesting material. And so what I'm really interested in now, and like what my question will be, is on these intellectual paperbacks. So what I'm looking into is the same kind of material in the German context. So after 1945, I mean, you have the same phenomenon. And what I'm interested in is the way biologists or life scientists play in these in this literature. So not so much a particular kind of theory, but more the conversation in general. And what I was seeing is that in the German context, you have a very particular type of life scientists, biologists, mostly actually zoologists, who would author these kind of books, and they would actually touch a lot on questions of human nature. They would touch a lot on anthropology, human evolution, behavioral, what have you. And so I was wondering whether you could, whether you would have the same phenomenon in the American context, and whether you have some idea why this type of sort of scientists who would write, people like organismal. I mean, you call you talk about this type of biology, whether there is something kind of to it.
Absolutely. This is a great question. And I'm so glad that you are working on the German context, because I think it actually plays out really differently in Germany. I mean, my sense is that the longevity of the intellectual paperback in Germany is much longer. That was a terrible construction. That in Germany, the intellectual paperback has a much longer life, in part because, well, I don't know, actually. So I'm curious to see how this plays out. In terms of the people, the biologists who are choosing to write these books, and potentially why, I think there's a couple of different things. One is that there is, of course, this underlying, at least in the United States, there's an underlying tension between organismal biology and molecular biology at the time. And so we can think of biology in this moment that is trying to engage with larger public questions or larger public audiences as being characterized by two questions. What does it mean to be human? And what is life? And the molecular biologists are writing, I think some of them are writing the same kinds of books about what is life. And the organismal biologists are writing about what does it mean to be human. And there are two different ways, I think, of establishing the scientific relevance and authority of the field, but actually are after two different endpoints. And I think that, yeah, that's what I would say, is that I think some of it is defensive in essence, and that with the sequencing of, with the breaking of the genetic code, with understanding the structure of DNA, that there's a lot of potential power and promise built into molecular biology in this moment, and that organismal biologists are interested in being able to have a big, powerful question of their own that the molecular biologists will not be able to answer with molecules. And what does it mean to be human is one of those really big questions that they hope that will always be true for. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael Hagner is next on the list.
Yeah, hi, Erika. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this, what can I say, appetizer, introducing into your book, which I have not yet read, regrettably, but I will. I think I have two questions for the moment. The first question relates to the political context in which the work mainly by Robert Awdry was localized in the United States. The reason why I'm asking this question is that this guy and his version of human ancestry has a transatlantic context. His books were translated into German, and they were quite popular. They appeared as hardbacks and then later on as paperbacks in one of the most popular publishing houses. And they were widely distributed, and they were received, and that is the interesting thing, in the context of right-wing, conservative, politically conservative people who at the same time were arguing with Konrad Lorenz, whom you mentioned, Irenaeus Abel Eibesfeld, and other ethologists and organismic biologists. And they were arguing against left-wing communist milieu theoreticians and those ones who favored the environments over, biological determinism. So the old question of nature and nurture. And in West Germany, this was clearly politically divided. Mm-hmm. And I just would be curious to know about was that the same in the United States? Second question is very short. I think Awdry would serve perfectly well as a kind of model for the third culture that John Brockman started in the 1990s, though he's a bit early for that. So would it make sense to describe him as a kind of predecessor of the third culture in order to weaken the humanities? And if that question makes sense, what would be the similarities and what would be the differences?
Interesting. Both of these are interesting questions. Thank you so much. So for the first one, I very much decided with this book that I needed, because of the political context, that writing a book that was about how these theories got picked up and used in the United States was what I could handle in a book-length project. And many of these, some of the, like, in addition to Robert Awdry, who is American, but actually lives much of the life when he is writing these books in Rome. Konrad Lorenz obviously is not an American, although his works are translated into English and are very current in the United States. And Desmond Morris, who is British, his works are translated. So I have this very international array of sources that all come to the US in a very particular political context. And one of the things that I find fascinating is how much of the political context of the country of origin is erased in the importation to the United States. So that someone like Awdry, he is married to a South African, and so much of, and he was, Raymond Dart, I think, served as the officiant at their wedding in South Africa. And so the connotations of apartheid, like these theories and their connotations with apartheid in South Africa are very different than the way that they are read in the US, where the dominant thing that people are thinking about are the urban revolutions of the time period, are the feminist revolution, are thinking about the very local context of the place of African Americans and how white people in the United States are interpreting what is happening, et cetera, et cetera. So in Germany, it doesn't surprise me that the political context again would change as these works were translated and put into Germany. That said, Ardrey is an easy case to talk about with the political context of territory. And it is clear that his theories of aggression very much are built on the assumption that territory and the holding and defense of territory is natural to human nature. And he himself reads it as anti-communist, right? That like what makes human nature work is the defense of an individual territory against others, and that is a very masculine responsibility within human nature. So in Germany, that it would be read that way makes 100% sense. And also that the connotations of gendered relations within humans also get wrapped up in this. Certainly in the US, I would be unsurprised if they are read that way in Germany as well. As for the sort of the third culture and thinking about Ardrey as a predecessor of attempts to weaken the humanities, I really haven't thought about this before. I think that in my response to Christian, I said that there are these two major questions that biologists are invested in. One of them is, what is life? And the other is, what does it mean to be human? Well, what does it mean to be human is actually a very humanities question. And so in that way, I think it could be read as an attempt to reach into a territory that sorry, bad metaphor, given the context, to reach into an intellectual discussion that for centuries was seen as the jurisdiction of the humanities. And so maybe my sense is not that anyone who was writing in this moment would have seen it that way, that they didn't envision themselves as fighting with humanities scholars, but instead saw their main interlocutors as other people who have questions about biology. So I think that if we think about this question in terms of intentionality, we end up with very different answers than if we think about this question in terms of consequences. Thank you.
We have another question by Ines Hülsmann.
Hello, let me first thank you for your super inspiring book. I really enjoyed reading it, and also it makes a great case for a relational approach to study things not in isolation, but in fact bearing at the same question, which ties into my I have two questions. So I also want to refer to the German case, and there the question, what is human nature and how can we deal with it, all the questions and the past experiences that everyone had, was the question that was answered with new forms of staging discussions, for example, and combining art, intellectual discussions, and also experts like biologists and psychoanalysts and these kind of people. And also involved were very much also sociologists who actually had to ask themselves, are we studying humans, or are we a force for the social, in a sense? Very deep questions. And I wanted to ask you whether you could say something if this kind, I find this very particular for the German case, but it's inspired by other examples. And I wanted to ask you for the American case, because social science was a huge force after the Second World War in America. And also try to give up answers, data based on data and all that stuff, and to make themselves more of a important part of the scientific landscape, and whether that also creates tension, within, or how would you say that this veers into question of financing, and who had more answers, relevant answers for politicians, for example, this kind of controversy. And well, maybe that's just a big question. That's just two questions in one. If you could say something about the relation with the Cold War ideology, civilizing mission, something like that. How to, well, if maybe it's a thesis that if we have a ideological system that can cope with the aggressive ape, then maybe we are better at handling things than other countries, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There's a lot in here, so I will let me have a go, and if it doesn't work and you still have questions, please feel free to follow up.
I mean, I could ask my questions as a sort of, wow, I'm inspired. Maybe she can answer
very
some
kind.
of this.
Thank you. So there's a book by a historian called Mark Grief, who has, his book is called Age of Man, and it is specifically about how authors of fiction and in the arts are dealing with these same questions at the same time. And he chooses not to talk about science, and is, I think, very invested in the arts and the humanities as the repository of the place where questions of man, as it was called in this moment, were negotiated. And so part of my book is also a response to his, and that is to say, yes, but the sciences were also important, which as a historian of science is like, of course I'm going to say that. But I do think that the scientists who are claiming this public place for their own work are a very different set of scientists. And so in terms of social science, Margaret Mead, Lauren Isley, obviously the people who are working on primates are easy for us to see now as people who are primarily identified with biology and with zoology. But in the United States, they were often trained in anthropology departments and are still located in anthropology departments. And so primatology and paleoanthropology were often coded as social scientists rather than being coded as natural scientists in the United States. Financing is a huge thing, and financing, like, follow the money. It works in really interesting ways. One of the things I found really surprising about the work that I was doing is that the scientists operating in this moment are getting grants to do their work, but they're getting $10,000 from this private philanthropy over here and 10,000 from this other private philanthropy over there. And they're piecing together very small amounts of money from philanthropic organizations that give not only to these scientists, but also to a whole variety of other endeavors. And so in the historiography of the history of science, we tend, I think, to write about post-war science as being funded in the United States by the National Science Foundation, by the National Institutes of Health, by these huge federal granting systems that provide massive grants for big science. This is a very different scheme. These are small grants, individual people, often they come down to someone writing a check and handing it over at a dinner party. It's a very different kind of philanthropic investment and a very different vision of how you fund science than we typically talk about in the post-war period. And to then lap on top of that, this Cold War context, I mean, that's one way of getting into the Cold War. The other way is that actually these scientists are going everywhere and are studying lots of cultures in different places. And this is particularly true of the cultural anthropologists who are in this moment invested in what is now denigrated as salvage anthropology, where they really had a conviction that that certain cultures were disappearing. And in fact, their demise was inevitable. This is where the critique of this vision comes in now. And so therefore, they needed to get to these uncharted places to record how these cultures worked before they disappeared. And it is the expectation of extinction that is built into so much of the work that is done in this period when it comes to cultural anthropology that is really shocking now. So for example, Robert Gardner goes to Papua New Guinea and is very interested in studying many of the cultures in Papua New Guinea. And that's in part because he has a vision that when people have talked about violence in human society before, their basic assumption has always been that human history is peaceful, but is interrupted by moments of violence. And for Robert Gardner, he said, what if we have it wrong? What if war is the normal situation for human culture? And in fact, peace is the strange moment. And so he uses his studies in Papua New Guinea to try and answer that question, to go and study a people, a set of communities where war is assumed that it will never end, that there is no, okay, when is this going to be over so we can all get back to normal lives? This is normal life. And so that is a very, in retrospect, Cold War project about what is the function connotation of violence within society, both in terms of the sort of the conceptualization of the project, but also the very questions that it is posing of this material.
Thank you, Erika. So there's, I think, room for a short question and a short answer before we get to the informal part. So I think I just want to go back to the beginning of our conversation where you said you were interested in kind of uncovering the strings behind, for instance, like Donna Haraway's stories. So and I still have this in mind, and I think my question is. I mean, when you read this book, it's very clear that there are so many strings, and there, as you just said, there are people financing it. There's a book market, there's Hollywood, and so on. So who's pulling the strings? Especially if you compare it to Donna Haraway's book, because there it's pretty clear, right? It's a patriarchy and so on. But who's the driving force behind the killer ape theory? And so maybe I think that is a big question for 2 minutes, but I think I just put it like that. Yeah.
Thank you. I think the short version, the really short version, is to say that for me, the strings are the books, the images, the films, the pedagogy, and the way that those are self-consciously created to engage with a public conversation, to change the mind of the people who are consuming them, and also that that are actively consumed and reappropriated for other purposes that were not the intentions of the creators at all. So I do try to set up this the strings as a dynamic relationship between the people who are producing texts and the people who are reading texts. And I use text here to mean that whole variety of media that I talk about in the book, rather than seeing the strings as static, seeing them as a conversation.
Thank you so much, Erika. So it's 7 p.m. So I think time is up, unfortunately. So we are really.
Thank you. I appreciated all the questions. This is great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so thank you really, Erika, for joining us and investing your time in our second book forum. And we hope that all of you took away something, even if you haven't read the book. Niki and I have read it, and we even profited from the conversation. So thank you very much, Erika. And we will stay here, stay tuned for another like 20 minutes or so. And before we get to the informal part, I just want to mention our next book forum, which will take place on the 31st of March. And Stefan Graf, Vera Wolf, and Monika Bultz will have Matthew Hunter with us, who wrote the book Painting with Fire. It's on photography and the temporal evolving chemical objects. So at the end of March, join us again and sign up for the book forum. Then you get emails, and you can also follow us on Twitter. So we will be happy to see a lot of you again in 4 weeks. Okay, thank you again, Erika, and yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much.